What does it mean when I tell you I am Dominican, not black? Why do Dominicans deny they are black? It is a question that many people ask me when they find out that I am a dark-skinned black Dominican. The first problem with that question is assuming that all Dominicans are black, which demonstrates the little knowledge that many people have of the Dominican nation and its racial composition. The second is to assume that all nations have the same method of racial identification. Many people have the idea that others should see different racial classifications through their eyes. In this particular case, we must speak of African Americans in the United States who believe that everyone, especially black immigrants, should assume the same system of racial classification. From the moment they first lay their skin on North American territory, why do Dominicans deny being black? Or why do Dominicans deny their African heritage? To answer this question, there are three factors that we must consider. The first of these is the historical factor. To understand the meaning of being black in a post-racial society, like the Dominican, which was historically dominated by a racial caste system. The second is the racial factor, in which we must accept that there are intermediate racial groups, product of miscegenation in the Dominican Republic. For historical reasons, the Dominican accepts racial miscegenation as part of his genetic heritage, contrary to Afro-Americans who deny its existence. The third is the social factor, which is associated with the prejudices and racial stereotypes that are behind this need that some blacks in the Dominican Republic have to deny their racial identity, especially when we talk about blacks who clearly present Negroid characteristics, phenotype. If we all assume that race is a social construct, at the same time we must assume that each society has the right to create a racial classification that meets its needs based upon the different racial groups that compose it. The Dominican nation has the right to classify its population based on its own social construction, either using different types of races, different textures of races, different ethnic groups, but also taking skin color into account. In the same way, the American nation has the right to establish any classification that meets the expectations of its inhabitants when it comes to recognizing which racial group they belong to. All Dominicans are not black, just as all Dominicans are not white. The Dominican nation is a nation in which the majority of the population falls into the category of mulatto or biracial, to use a modern term. According to a 2016 genetic study of the Dominican population, in which a sample of 1,000 volunteers were taken, the Dominican population has 39% DNA of European ancestors, 49% African, and 4% pre-Columbian, or indigenous population, which confirms their complicated genetic ancestry and implies that being mulatto predominates among Dominicans. On the contrary, it is known that African Americans in the US have on average genes that are 73.2% African, 24% European, and 0.8% Native. Taking this data into consideration, let's continue with this analysis, based on data, not emotions. One of the big problems that African Americans have when they criticize Dominicans for not self-identifying as black or denying their blackness is failing to understand the history of the Dominican nation and the methodology used when talking about racial identity. Why do many Dominicans, characteristic Negroid or African descent, not identify as black? To answer this question, first we have to understand that Dominicans do not use the one drop of blood rule as a method of racial identification, unlike the African American population in the United States. For many African Americans, 90% of the population in Dominican Republic is black, which is an erroneous conclusion when we talk about the different racial mixtures and the high number of miscegenation that existed and still exists in post-slavery nations like the Dominican Republic. African Americans at this time don't accept the existence of intermediate racial groups between the black race and white race, hypodescent. We all know that in all the post-slavery nations in America that are the product of racial miscegenation, To deny the racial reality of these nations is to ignore that these different racial mixtures exist. For African Americans, the mulatto population, that is, of mixed race, does not exist, contrary to the Dominicans. Dominicans are proud of their African, European, and indigenous ancestors, contrary to African Americans who hate to recognize the European genetic contribution that exists in it. What type of racial identity is closer to the reality of the genetic mixture between African Americans and Dominicans? This is where the application of the rule of a single drop of African blood loses when you make a genetic comparison on the different racial mixtures, which is closer to the reality of the racial composition of people and more when you compare it with the classification racial used by Dominicans, which concentrates mainly on people's skin color and not genetic inheritance of parents. Right now, the racial classification based on the rule of a single drop of blood denies the racial identity of mulattoes, biracials, mestizos, and sambos. All these racial groups that are the product of racial miscegenation lie under the umbrella of being black. Because for some Afrocentrists, anyone who possesses certain levels of blackness is considered black. Racial classifications which are arbitrarily imposed on people of mixed race within the black community using the terms dark-skinned black and light-skinned black. Did you know that African Americans only began to use the one drop of blood rule during racial segregation? According to figures from the American census during the 18th century and the 19th century, North Americans used the terms white, quadroon, octoroon, mulatto, and black as a form of racial classification, which you show that race is a social construction. Second, we must understand that territory that is now the Dominican Republic was a Spanish colony in the Caribbean which used the Spanish racial caste system as a method of racial classification, based mostly on parental racial heritage. Dominicans still somewhat use a form of classification using this method, but based on people's skin color, hair type, and racial characteristics that are designated for those considered black, white, and indigenous population. For the Dominican, black is that person who has all the characteristics of a person of black or Negroid race, bad hair, flat nose, and big bembe. Having a black father or mother does not make you a person black. For political or personal reasons, during the Trujillo dictatorship, the term mulatto, given its derogatory nature, was replaced by Indian, which created a series of racial categories associated with this term, among which are light Indian, washed Indian, dark Indian, cinnamon Indian. But the black also created its own categories such as brown, red black, dark skin black, light skin black. And for whites, new categories arose such as faded white, white pink, blonde, or white. Why does the Dominican deny being black? Apart from looking at it from the point of view of racial heritage in relation to the mulattoes or mestizos population, we must also look at it from a social position and the impact of what it means for the person who assumes this racial identity. This is where the negative stereotypes and racial prejudices associated with the word black have a greater influence. A nation like a republican where classism is dominant, being black means being poor, without any kind of influence or success, while being white means being rich. Those who enjoy the sweetness of power could be one of the reasons for denying blackness for some. For some of them, who as a product of ignorance assume that type of negative attitude against their African racial heritage. But these are a minority. Historically, in any Latin American society, blacks have always been considered a second-class person, which is why many Afro-descendants in many of these nations refuse to accept this racial identification, even though many of them clearly present Negroid characteristics, and some black Dominicans is no exception. We could say the same when we see many black African Americans who present Caucasian or European characteristics and their genetic characteristics, phenotype, who despite having a white father, self-identify as black. Finally, we have to understand the effect on the self-esteem of the black person who lives in a society historically controlled by whites and mulattoes. Everything is a matter of political power, but also economic power and possession of wealth. Many blacks want to be mulattoes, dark Indian or light-skinned black. In the same way, many mulattoes want to be white. African Americans criticize mulatto and biracial Dominicans for denying their blackness, calling it self-hatred. But when some of them deny their white heritage, they call it a self-loving black. Here we can all see the hypocrisy and contradictions that feed that anti-Dominican feeling that exists in some black bloggers. Something we must understand: everyone wants to look like those who have power and wealth. Dominicans are no exception. In all post-slave societies, like the Dominican, black is associated with poverty, ugly, and brutality. On the contrary, white is associated with wealth, beauty, and intelligence. For me, it is another of the reasons why the black Dominican does not want to accept that he or she is black. Even though we can all see the black characteristics dominate the phenotype of those people who deny blackness. Something that African Americans should know about Dominicans is that when Dominicans are in front of the mirror, they do not look at their skin color as the reason behind their economic, political, or family situation. When a Dominican doesn't have an ideal job, he doesn't blame the skin color as the main reason either. The Dominican does not have the skin color as the main focus of their life, and more so when you live in a society where a large majority of the population has the same skin color as you. The black-skinned Dominican does not have to tell the world that he or she is black because it is something that everyone can see. For a large majority of Dominicans, their first concern is based on the differences between the different social classes and the low ability to acquire wealth in a part of the population. Little opportunity to acquire wealth, which is a product of the negative effects of classism in society, which prevents the poor from achieving better economic conditions. Dominicans suffer the negative effects of classism more than the negative effects of discrimination and negative stereotypes associated with skin color. For the Dominican, there is nothing worse than being poor, and more so when you are black. The problem for many Dominicans is that a large number fall into both forms of discrimination in the Dominican Republic. Many Dominicans are poor and black at the same time. Skin color is something that cannot be changed. On the contrary, the economic situation is something that you can change. Perhaps that is the reason why Dominicans do not focus on their skin color, but on how to create strategies that bring economic well-being to the family. Something that Afro-Americans should understand: racial identity, African heritage, or blackness has never been the center of attention of Dominicans in a society considered mostly as mixed race or mulatto. Perhaps for this reason, when Dominicans step to the territory of the United States, their nationality is the identity that defines them, not the color of their skin or racial heritage. For Dominicans in the United States, the reality is that racial identity means nothing, contrary to nationality, which means everything, because the Dominican is proud of the country where he was born. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like this type of work, please like and share this type of work.